Good morning, everyone. My name is Arsani. I'm a member of the programming team, and I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker today, Dr. Ken Tao, Vice President and Director of MCAT at MedSchoolCoach and one of the leading MCAT experts in the country. He's earned degrees in bioengineering and molecular and cell biology from UC Berkeley and completed his PhD in neuroscience at Harvard and Harvard Medical School. Dr. Tao has worked with thousands of pre-med students as a teaching assistant, MCAT instructor, and tutor. At the Princeton Review, he was the only tutor certified to teach all MCAT subjects. He helped train other instructors and contributed to MCAT prep books used nationwide. His students consistently see major score gains, including scores above 520 on the current MCAT. Today, Dr. Tao will walk us through how the MCAT is structured, how it connects to your coursework, and how to study efficiently without wasting time on outdated strategies. Thank you for being here, Dr. Tao.
Great. Thanks for that introduction and happy to be here again. This is the second part of a four-part series on the MCAT and how to prepare for the exam. So in our last presentation, we really focused on coursework. So the prerequisite courses that you have to take in preparation for MCAT and how to succeed in those classes. Today, we're going to introduce the MCAT, talk about the format of the exam, and more details about how to prepare for the MCAT, but still connecting it to coursework. So this is going to build on to what we talked about in our last session, and in subsequent sessions, we're going to transition from coursework more into the MCAT exam strategies and how to best prepare for the exam. I'm going to skip my introduction because I, gave a bit of a background yesterday. So I'm just going to go into today's presentation. So in terms of coursework, on this slide, I have the courses that you will want to take before you take the MCAT. So you'll see that includes 1 year of general biology with lab, 1 year of general chemistry with lab, 1 year of organic chemistry with lab, 1 year of physics with lab, 1 semester of biochemistry, as well as psychology and sociology. And some of this I mentioned yesterday, but we can reiterate because these points are important and some of you might not have been present yesterday. And that is, of all of these different courses, the one that I highly recommend students take before they take the MCAT is biochemistry. And that's really because of how high yield biochemistry is on the exam. And a lot of students aren't aware of this, and a lot of students also don't plan their coursework accordingly. And what I mean by that is a lot of students want to take the MCAT in their junior year, some in their senior year, but many students who want to be what we call traditional applicants who apply to medical school the summer after their junior year want to take the MCAT in their junior year. The problem, though, is when you look at a lot of these classes for the chemistry series, they follow a specific order where you usually have to take chemistry 1 before you can take chemistry 2. Then you have to take organic chemistry 1 before you can take organic chemistry 2. And then you can finally take biochemistry. So essentially, you would have to take all 5 chemistry courses in a row without ever taking a break in any of your semesters, just to make sure that you can take biochemistry in the fall of your junior year so you can be ready to take the MCAT in the spring of your junior year. A lot of students don't follow this specific order, though. They sort of take gaps and breaks between general chemistry, organic chemistry, and biochemistry. And some find that they're not able to take biochemistry until their senior year, especially if their university is smaller and has certain restrictions. For example, maybe biochemistry is only offered in the spring and not in the fall. So that's something for you to think about. And I always encourage students early on as freshmen or sophomore to essentially map out their coursework to make sure they can take all of the prerequisite courses before the MCAT. And also, this is a good way for you to be able to plan out your schedule such that you're not taking more than 2 hard science courses per semester. As I mentioned yesterday, if you add up all of these courses, and keep in mind, Psych Soc isn't really considered a hard science course, but the amount of hard science courses you have to take isn't that many, and you can easily take 2 per semester and have no issues completing all of these courses before you want to take the MCAT, even if you want to take it in your junior year. Another thing I also didn't mention yesterday that a lot of students will often do is they'll take summer classes. So if, for example, you decide, hey, I took general chemistry 1 in the fall, general chemistry 2 in the spring, If you want to get a head start, you can take organic chemistry that summer after your freshman year and before your sophomore year. And again, that just helps to reduce the uh, course load that you have, and that also helps you to maintain a higher GPA. So again, biochemistry is really the course that I really, really recommend students take before the MCAT. So now, how about other courses? Let's say you are missing, uh, one of these classes or two before you take the exam. It's possible for you to take the MCAT. Just realize you have to put in more effort. So if you're missing physics two or organic chemistry two, you can make it work. It just means that you have to do a little bit of extra self-studying for that subject. But it's just biochemistry that is so high yield that you put yourself at a very serious disadvantage. And psychology and sociology, as I said, uh, uh, they're tested on the exam, but the concepts are usually fairly straightforward. But most students can learn these concepts on their own. So a lot of students don't ever take psychology or sociology before taking MCAT. But that being said, for a lot of students, psychology and sociology can be on the easier side and can be nice GPA boosters. So if you have two hard science courses and you're looking to fill in additional classes, psychology and sociology are good options, especially if your school has certain humanities requirements, right? So, instead of taking a music class or a language class, just because it's something that interests you and is good for your GPA, you can take psychology and sociology, where it can be helpful for your GPA and also helpful for your MCAT prep down the line. All right. Now, since we've gone over these courses, let's continue forward with essentially the black box of being a pre-med. So it's a little interesting being a pre-med that all of the information that you need to know to become a pre-med and a successful pre-med, you often can't find in a single location, right? It's not like there's a one-page guide that tells you everything. And students hear a lot of things like, oh, you should do this, you should do that. Um, so it can be tricky for students to really fully understand what exactly they need to do to be successful as a pre-med. So I would say one thing that's kind of nice is that all of you, by participating in these events hosted by Pre-Med CC, you're really able to understand what you need to do to be a successful pre-med. So you're not really in this black box of unknown. Now, as for the MCAT tends to be a little bit more straightforward compared to other aspects of, hey, for physician shadowing, how many different kinds of physicians, how many different specialties do I need exposure to? How many hours do I need? Some of those, can be more can be less straightforward, right? Sometimes you have to hear from admissions committee members to learn how much physician shadowing experience that you need. And often you hear different responses because the one medical school's perspective on clinical experience may be different from another medical school's. The MCAT, though, is not that way. The MCAT is a standardized exam, and it's created by the AAMC, who represents all of the allopathic or MD medical schools across the country. And because it's a standardized exam, all of the details that you need to know about the MCAT you can find online on the AMC's website. There's actually a document called the Official Guide to the MCAT, where you can read in immense detail everything about the MCAT exam, the format of the MCAT exam, how they designed the MCAT exam and why they designed the MCAT the way they did, how is the MCAT scored, what are the different concepts tested, and there's even a very detailed AAMC MCAT content outline that provides a bullet point list of every single concept that's tested on the exam. So the point is, there's no mystery behind the MCAT, right? Anything you want to know about the MCAT, you can find online from the AMC's website. Now, that being said, it's easier said than done, right? Which is a lot of students will go online and they'll read those guides, but it still doesn't tell them everything about the MCAT. And what I mean by that is a lot of students sort of have this idea of, Okay, on the last slide, you just told me all the prerequisite courses for MCAT. So I'm going to take all those courses and I should be good to go, right? I should just be able to take the MCAT without any additional prep. And unfortunately, it doesn't quite work that way. So even though much of the details of the format of the exam is published on the AMC's website, there's still quite a lot of information that you don't really learn until you start studying for the MCAT. This applies to both the science content that's tested on exam, as well as additional strategies and techniques that you need to be successful with the exam. So let's start first with the content aspect. What do I mean about there's content that you're going to learn that you need to know only when you start studying for the exam? Well, it's essentially that you have to recognize that the curriculum of a science course that you take at your university is not going to match the curriculum of the MCAT. So what that means is when you take general chemistry, organic chemistry, physics, biology, biochemistry, psychology, and sociology at your university, what you learn is whatever your professor decides is important. It's not the professor who's designing their course specifically for pre-meds taking the MCAT. So in many cases, you're going to be learning science content in your college courses that aren't tested on the MCAT, and vice versa. Uh, there's going to be science content tested on the MCAT that you won't learn about in your college courses. So that's what I mean by the fact that, like, yes, it's important for you to take the MCAT prerequisite courses, but just realize that there's a good amount of content that is going to be tested on the exam that you won't have learned before. Now, it doesn't mean you're at a disadvantage. The same is true for every student. So every student is going to run into these issues. What helps you, though, is by attending these presentations, I'm giving you a heads up. You're already learning in advance that there's going to be science content tested on the exam that you probably won't have learned in your college courses. Now, the other aspect is more related to strategies, which is in your college courses, you're going to learn the science content, but learning the science content often isn't enough to answer MCAT questions correctly. And that's because the MCAT isn't so much about asking, hey, do you know the science content? It's more about, do you know how to apply the science content? And that's because, in terms of how the MCAT is structured, there are a lot of passages and there are questions associated with these passages. And the way it works is you have to read these passages. And then after you read these passages, you're going to be exposed to new information and new situations that you've never learned about before. And you might be thinking, well, how's that fair? How's it fair for the MCAT to give us all these passages covering science content and experiments and topics that we haven't learned before? Well, it's not that it's unfair. It's more so that the AAMC expects you to be able to apply your knowledge of the science content to new situations to be able to answer the questions correctly. So that's a lot of the passage aspects with strategies. And one thing I'll add is as it pertains to those strategies for better understanding passages to answer those questions, a lot of it actually goes to research. You'll recall yesterday I mentioned that the MCAT's not written by MDs, right? It's not written by medical doctors. The MCAT's actually written by PhDs. And a lot of the passages in the science sections of the exam are adapted from peer-reviewed scientific journal articles. And for students who don't have a lot of research experience, they'll read these passages and they'll feel like they don't understand anything. And that's common for a lot of students. So one thing you can try to do is try to get research experience earlier, because the more research experience that you have, which, keep in mind, you already need research as a pre-med for most medical schools. The earlier you can start getting research experience, the more research experience that you get, the better the position you will be for those research passages on the exam. All right, so Now let's talk a little bit more about the format of the exam. So the exam has four sections, and each section has a very long name. So the first section is the chemical and physical foundations of biological systems. And given this long name, we tend to just call it using its shorthand, which is ChemPhys. The same is true for the other sections. You have the ChemPhys section, the CARS section, the BioChem section, as well as the Psych-Soc section. Now, the MCAT is a very long exam. The science sections, ChemPhys, Biochem, and Psych-Soc, are each 95 minutes long, and the CARS section is 90 minutes long. All right. And let's just try to put this in perspective, right? Because if what we're saying is that the Chem-Phys section is 95 minutes, CARS is 90 minutes, Biochem is 95 minutes, and the Psych-Soc section is 95 minutes. That means the total testing time is 6 hours and 15 minutes. And keep in mind, this is the amount of time that you're spending reading passages and answering questions in one day, 6 hours and 15 minutes. And it's not that you're going to sit there and do 6 hours and 15 minutes of practice in a row, right? Obviously, you're given breaks. You have a 10-minute break between the ChemPhys and the CARS section. You have a 30-minute lunch break between the CARS and the Biochem section. And you have a 10-minute break between the Biochem and Psych-Soc section. So if you take into account those breaks, plus, keep in mind you have to arrive early at the testing center so that way you can register. And there's also a tutorial before the MCAT begins, and there's a brief survey you have to fill out. If you add up all of these, your MCAT testing experience will usually be about 7.5 hours. That's very impressive because most students aren't used to taking exams this long. If you're at a university, your final exam is usually at most maybe 3 or 4 hours long. So this is actually an important point to note because most students are not used to sitting down and taking an MCAT exam that's 7.5 hours long. And given that, that means most students, they're going to experience fatigue simply when taking the MCAT. And especially if you haven't taken a practice exam before, I'm pretty certain after just the first section of the exam, you're already going to be tired at the second section, even more exhausted at the third section, and barely able to maintain focus in the last section. That's actually an issue because for a lot of students, they might think, oh, the Psych-Soc section is the easiest section of the exam. It's fine if I, finish early. And, some students will finish 40 minutes early or 45 minutes early. But often it's not because the section is easy. It's often just because they honestly are mentally exhausted and just can't maintain focus anymore. And many of them are just forget it. I just want to be done with the exam at this point. But obviously, you can understand how that's not good for your MCAT performance because if you're not putting in your full effort and attention in one of the 4 sections of the exam, then you're probably not going to be able to perform your best on that section of the exam. So how can you combat this? It's simple. Do a lot of practice, take a lot of full-length practice exams to make sure you can build the stamina required to maintain focus throughout the entire duration of the exam. So that way you can really put in your best effort and get the best score that you can. All right, so now let's talk about each section in greater detail. We'll start with the Chem-Phys section, going in order. You can see here that the Chem-Phys section actually tests a variety of subjects. 30% of the questions are going to test you on general chemistry, 25% on biochemistry, 25% on physics, 15% in organic chemistry, and 5% in biology. Now, one of these things that you can note, which makes the MCAT very different from your college exams, is normally when you have a final exam, it's maybe a 3-hour exam on physics. And even then, it's on Physics 1 or Physics 2 because students aren't taking both semesters of physics at the same time. Here on the MCAT, you have a single section of the exam that is testing multiple subjects simultaneously. So this is really quite important because many students don't think about the science sections this way. And if you're present for my presentation yesterday, you'll recall how I emphasized that, the cram and dump approach is just not effective for the MCAT. If you learn general chemistry for the class after your final, you dump all that information and then you move on to physics, and then you repeat that, you end up in this situation where you've forgotten most of the information and you have no idea how to connect these different concepts together. That's something that students have to think about too, because you can have a single passage with five questions, and two of the questions could be general chemistry, one of the questions can be organic chemistry, and two of the questions can be physics. So you really have to be agile and be able to switch back and forth between different subjects in your brain. You can't just be in physics mode or biology mode. You have to be able to connect these different concepts. And of course, if they're constantly flipping back and forth between different subjects, it's because the chemistry and the physics are often tested under biological scenarios. So, for example, if you're going to be looking at fluid flow with physics, it's not just water moving in a pipe. It's probably blood moving through your arteries, capillaries, or veins. And it's not to say that there aren't strategies, right? I'm presenting to you the challenges that I should think about of why it's hard to score well in the Chem Phys section, but it's also important to think of what can you do to succeed in this section. And one of these things is dimensional analysis, right? I talked about how sometimes in the Chem Phys section you might forget an equation, and dimensional analysis can really save you if you know what the units are and can figure out how to piece together the different variables to get the actual equation you need. Something else, though, that we didn't talk about that's also important is improved memorization. So, why do I say this? Well, when it comes to the MCAT exam, the two sections that students often struggle in terms of pacing are the Chem Phys sections as well as the CARS section. So, what do I mean by this? Well, earlier I said that you have 95 minutes for the three science sections and you have 90 minutes for the CARS section. So you might be thinking, oh, yeah, I've got plenty of time. I've got no issues, being able to take my time and slowly answer the questions because I've got about an hour and a half. But it doesn't actually work that way. For the science sections, yes, you have 95 minutes, but you also have 10 passages that you have to read, and you have 59 questions that you have to answer. And sure, you might be thinking 59 questions, 95 minutes. All right, I've got about a minute and a half per question. That's already a good amount of time pressure, right? Think about it. You only have a minute and a half to answer each question. But keep in mind, you have to read the passages too. And for most students, they're going to spend, around 2 minutes reading each passage. So you've lost another 20 minutes. Plus, anytime you get to a question, you have to first read the question to understand what the question is even asking you about. So the actual amount of time that you have to, really think and answer each question, it's closer to about a minute. So a minute per question. It's a good amount of time pressure. So again, you have to think fast. And again, if you're not able to think fast, especially for students who are just starting with your MCAT prep, you often finish the exam having many questions and passages blank, right? Which, first of all, you never want to do because there's no guessing penalty on the exam. So even if you run out of time, you should at least, pick C or B for every answer choice, just so you at least have a 25% chance of getting the answer correct just by guessing. Um, but of course, if you have to guess on questions because you didn't have time to guess on to think about them and answer them, you're also, of course, not going to be able to score your best. So this is a question that students often ask me, which is, how can I improve my pacing? How can I get through the Chem Phys section faster? How can I get through the CARS section faster? Well, when it comes to the Chem Phys section, one of the best ways to do this is to improve your memorization. And the best way to illustrate this is actually with an example. So here on the next slide, I'm going to present a question, and I'm also going to set a timer. So what I'm going to do is, there's going to be a question on the slide, and all of you, have the chat box in the Zoom that you can use to write the answer. When I go to the slide, I'm going to start the timer and see how long it takes for us to get the answer to this question. And we'll start now.
And you
The
could put
question
stuff
is,
in the chat too.
yes, the question is, what are the one-letter codes for the 3 basic amino acids? And the timer is running. The one-letter codes for the 3 basic amino acids. Keep in mind there's 3. There we go. We got our first correct answer, and that took us 35 seconds. Now, you might be thinking, 35 seconds isn't that big of a deal. But first of all, keep in mind, this is 35 seconds out of all of you who are present, right? Obviously, when you take the MCAT, it's not like all of you can work together. So, for many of you, it might be infinity if you just don't know the answer. But for many of you, it probably is going to take you even longer to be able to recall the one-letter code for the 3 basic amino acids. But the key thing is the fastest responder here is 35 seconds. And what I'll tell you is, for many students who are well prepared for the exam, if I ask them the same question, they'll immediately tell me H or K. And you might be thinking, okay, well, big deal, right? Like 5 seconds, 35 seconds. I'm not racing this other student. Well, remember I said earlier, a lot of students have issues with pacing in the Chem Phys section, and they often run out of time. There might be 10 questions they didn't get to, but think about what I just said. It took us 35 seconds to recall this fact. A prepared student can recall this in 5 seconds. That's 30 seconds. And it's not just for this question, because of the prepared student can recall the information faster across all 59 questions. That's 30 questions times 59. That's now 30 minutes. Save the students 30 minutes of time. And 30 minutes is more than plenty of time to answer the 10 questions that you didn't have time to get to. Now, of course, it probably doesn't work this way for every question. That, it might be tough for you to be able to recall every fact in 5 seconds. But my point still stands, which is you might think that you know the science content because you're able to recall, HRK in 35 seconds. But my point again is, if you have the information better memorized, that will save you time, which is extremely valuable for students who are aiming for higher scores on the exam. All right, so that's the Chem Phys section. Let's now move on to the CAR section. The CAR section, for a lot of students, can be the most difficult section, and that's because it doesn't test any knowledge of science content. It also doesn't test any prior knowledge of humanities or social studies. What I mean is, half the passages in the CAR section are going to be on humanities topics, and half the passages are going to be on social studies topics. If you're reading a passage and it's about Picasso and art, the MCAT's not expecting you to have any knowledge or understanding of art or Picasso. Same thing if they're giving you a passage on the history of poetry, or if they're giving you a passage on Plato's philosophy, they're not expecting you to know any of that information. So for a lot of students, sometimes they run into this issue where they think, well, there's nothing I can study for the CAR section. So there's nothing I can study, I'm just not going to study for the CAR section. And that's actually a really big mistake. Because again, the CAR section is one of the 4 sections of the exam. And if you score very poorly in the CAR section, that poor CAR score alone can keep you out of most medical schools. So just because there's no science content to study doesn't mean that there aren't things that you can do to prepare for the CAR section. And, a big thing is practice, right? You need to make sure you're doing a lot of CARS practice, but also it's not just about doing a lot of passages because, again, I hear from a lot of students that, oh, I've been told I should do a daily cars passage, right? Like every day I should do a cars passage. Well, if all you're doing is you're doing cars passage, you read the passage, you read the questions, you answer the questions. If every day you're missing a lot of questions, to me, it's almost like, telling someone every day you should punch a wall, right? Like, yes, you're doing something every day, but, the only one that's getting hurt is yourself, right? So if all you're doing is a lot of cars passages and you have no plan, you have no strategy, how do you expect to improve, right? And, sometimes you'll hear from students this advice that I don't think is very good, which is you just have to do a lot of practice and eventually your score is going to go up. But again, like I said, it's like if you keep punching the wall every day, like what do you expect to happen? It's not like you're going to become, the Hulk and be able to smash through the wall, right? So, yes, practice is important, but far more important than the practice itself is the review. You need to make sure you really review the passage and the questions afterwards to be able to understand, hey, if I perform poorly on this cars passage, what exactly was my issue? And what I'll say is, for a lot of students that are weak in the cars section, as in, if you're scoring below 124 in cars, if you've got a 120, 121, 122, 123 in cars, the reality is you just don't understand most of the cars passages. And I know some of this might seem trivial because you're thinking like, I understand English, I read this passage and I understand the passage. Well, I highly encourage you to go through this exercise when you're studying for the MCAT, which is number one, find a friend or classmate or a colleague, find someone who is good at cars. And you yourself, who is not good at cars, the two of you are going to read the same cars passage. And after you finish reading the cars passage, you both explain your understanding of the passage, right? What did you think was the main idea of the passage? What did you think was the central thesis of the passage? And then hear what your peer who is good at cars will say. And I can almost guarantee that the two of you are going to say very different things. And that's a huge issue because if the way that you're reading the cars passage leaves you with a very different conclusion than someone who's scoring well in cars, that essentially means you're not reading the cars passages correctly. And that's something you have to really think about, which is if my reading comprehension is poor, if I'm not understanding the passage, well, of course, I'm going to end up missing a lot of questions, but what can I do to combat that? Well, again, it goes back to when you review the passage, what was the point that the author was really trying to make? And what exactly did I miss? Did I, focus too much on certain words in the passage? Did I not pay enough attention to certain paragraphs? Did I just ignore certain words? You need to figure out what exactly you were missing to be able to understand what you can do differently so you can improve your car's performance next time. Like I said, you can't just keep punching the wall, right? Like you need to figure out something different that you can do to improve your performance. And one thing I'll say here that a lot of students don't think about is the car section tests your reasoning skills and your ability to identify and evaluate arguments. It's not simply, this is a passage about Picasso and the paintings that he drew. Instead, AMC passages are along the lines of, how did Picasso become a successful artist? Was it because he experimented a lot with his drawings as a child? Was it because he was always more talented than other artists? Or was it because he had to go through some kind of transformation? That's the way AMC passages will be written. And you'll notice I just asked three questions. And that's because passages will often present multiple thoughts, and you have to figure out, of those different thoughts, which is the argument that the author is pushing for. So again, a lot of students don't pick up on this. So when they're reading CARS passages, they don't really know what they should be thinking, what they should be asking, what they should be paying attention to. And this is also another great situation to go through, this technique I mentioned yesterday, the framing technique, which essentially is teach someone else. So when it comes to studying for the MCAT, I mentioned this yesterday, which is, sure, you can study by yourself, but realize that, sometimes studying with others can actually help you a lot with your MCAT preparation. And CARS is no different from the science sections, right? Again, don't just think that, the CARS section doesn't test any science. There's nothing for me to study. There's nothing for me to teach someone else. Well, again, a very good exercise is if you have a peer and, maybe they're good at CARS, maybe they're not so good at CARS, what you can do is you both complete a practice passage together. And after you complete the practice passages, you talk through the passage together and try to explain your understanding of the passage to the other person. That is an excellent way to improve in CARS, because if you say like, hey, in this passage, this is what I thought, if the other person doesn't agree or they didn't notice that point, then you can have the discussion on why did you think that way, right? And when you have that discussion, you might realize there's something that you did wrong, right? There was something you misread. There's something that you ignored that you shouldn't have ignored. And these are the key things that you have to learn if you want to improve your reading comprehension and ultimately get more CARS questions correct. So the big thing here with CARS is making sure you can change the way that you think about the CARS section. Otherwise, if you just keep doing practice questions, keep using the same approach, keep using the same logic, how can you expect your score to improve? All right, so that's the CARS section. And one last thing I'll say about the CARS section before we go to biochemistry is that for a lot of students, what I'll often hear from them is, the reason why I score poorly in the CARS section is because of pacing. I run out of time and, I can't get to all the passages. That's true for some students, but for a lot of students, that's honestly not the case. So something that I often tell students, who tell me that the reason why they can't do one of the CARS section is because of timing, well, I tell them, all right, sure, go ahead and take a CARS section untimed. Spend as much time as you want. If you want to spend, 3 hours, 4 hours, 5 hours on a CARS section, that's perfectly fine with me. Now, in how many of those cases, does the student suddenly go from a 122 to a 130, let alone a 128, 127? The answer is almost never. So, the point is, yes, pacing is something you need to worry about for the CARS section, but for a lot of students, their issue isn't even pacing, because if you can't even get your target score in the CARS section with unlimited time, then why bother adding in that time pressure? So often, when students are starting out preparing for the CARS section, I often tell them, don't time yourself. Like, give yourself as much time as you need, right? First, focus on reading comprehension and accuracy. Now, once your reading comprehension is where you want it to be, once your accuracy on the CARS questions is where you want to be, then you can introduce the time pressure. But the main point I'm trying to make is if your accuracy is not where it needs to be, adding in a time pressure is not going to help. All right. So accuracy needs to come first, and then you can focus on pacing for the CARS section. All right, let's talk about the biochem section. So the biochem section, you can see here, it's 65% biology, 25% biochemistry, 5% general chemistry, and 5% organic chemistry. If you're looking at the slides and pay attention to the percentages, you'll notice, as I said, that biology is the most important, right? It's 5% of the chem phys section, 65% of the biochem section, so that gets us to 70%. But after biology, it's actually biochemistry, because biochemistry is 25% of both the chem phys section as well as the biochem section, though that gets you to 50%, which is more than general chemistry, organic chemistry, as well as physics. So that's why, again, I really emphasize how high yield biochemistry is for the exam. Now, Biology, we certainly understand why it's important because we know that you're trying to become a physician. And in terms of how biochemistry is tested on the exam, it's essentially split 50-50 between the small stuff and physiology. So what's all the small stuff? This is your cellular biology, this is your molecular biology, this is genetics, this is microbiology, this is all of the small stuff that you learn. The other half is physiology, and when you look at physiology, this is when you're looking at all of the different organ systems, the nervous system, the endocrine system, the digestive system, the immune system, the muscular system, the renal system, right? Those are the two halves, and both of them are going to be important when you think about preparing for the biochem section of the exam. Now, biochemistry also has two aspects, which is one aspect of biochemistry. It's going to be with looking at the molecular pathways, right? So metabolism, glycolysis, Krebs cycle, electron transport chain, pentose phosphate pathway, glycogenolysis, glycogenesis, gluconeogenesis, all of that. The other half of biochemistry is looking at enzyme kinetics. So this is looking at Michaelis-Menten kinetics. Both important, both high yield for the exam. Now, in terms of strategies to prepare for the biochem section, I've already mentioned them, but I'll emphasize them again because a lot of students sometimes miss these connections. The first part is what I talked about yesterday, which is thinking about the systems, right? Which, going back, you want to be able to pick any system and just be able to walk through step by step how exactly do these systems work in terms of from start to finish. So yesterday, the examples I gave you of were with the digestive system as well as what's the other system I talked about? Oh, it was about the kidneys. Again, you can pick any system that you want. So another system that we can maybe consider is the immune system. So with the immune system, same question, right? Start first by asking yourself, hey, if I have a person and they're exposed to a pathogen, and let's say they have a bacterial infection, you want to be able to think step by step what's going to happen when this person is exposed to that bacteria. And you might say, okay, well, the first thing that's going to happen is that this person, they're going to they're going to feel sick, right? They're not going to feel well. They're going to start to feel some of the symptoms if the bacteria gets past their innate immune system. But then you might walk through the other steps and be like, okay, so the next thing that's going to happen is your naive B cells with their antibodies is going to recognize the bacteria. This is going to stimulate the naive B cell to divide and proliferate, specifically into memory B cells that stick around, as well as plasma B cells that secrete antibodies. And when they secrete the antibodies, it's going to bind to the pathogen. And then that's going to trigger the complement system to essentially destroy that pathogen, right? So again, think about these things as systems and be able to understand step by step what happens. And that's really important because sometimes the MCAT's going to ask you, about your knowledge. Do you understand how the system works? And sometimes it's going to ask you, if I break something, what's going to change, right? So both of these things are important to think about if you're trying to score well in the biochemistry section. Make sure you understand the systems because they'll ask you how the systems work, but also make sure you understand when something breaks, what's the consequence of that. All right, so that's the biochem section. We can now move on to the psych-soc section. The psych-soc section, 65% psychology, 30% sociology, 5% biology. Again, there's a lot of students who think of the psych-soc section as being the easiest section of the exam, and there's some aspect of that which is true because a lot of it is memorizing a lot of terms and definitions. But again, you have to go back to what I said earlier, which is the psych-soc section is not testing your ability to memorize terms and definitions, and that's because there's no questions in the psych-soc section that simply ask you, what's the definition of X? What's the definition of Y? Right? So if you're not going to have questions that ask you definitions, then what do the questions in the psych-soc section ask you? And it's often passage-based. So these passages will describe some kind of scenario, and then they're going to ask you about those scenarios. So they might say, like, hey, this phenomena that occurred in the passage, this is an example of what? So in those cases, recognize that they're not simply asking you for definitions, they're asking you to be able to apply concepts. So the best recommendation that I have for students when they're preparing for the psych-soc section is essentially to think about examples. For every single concept, for every single term, make sure you have a concrete example in your brain of what that term is and how that term works. So, if you're thinking about operant conditioning, make sure you can think of an example of positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment, negative punishment. Also think about the reinforcement schedules. Make sure you can also think about fixed ratio, variable ratio, fixed interval, variable interval. For all of these different concepts, make sure you know a concrete example. And I know this might sound simple, but you'll be surprised how many students that I talk to where they don't think about that. And because they don't think about that, they're not able to score as high in the psych-soc section, even though they're thinking that the psych-soc section is the easiest section of the exam. So just a little bit of tips of how you can specifically prepare for each of the 4 sections of the exam. We can now talk a little bit more about coursework and prep. And a lot of this I've discussed before. So this is just emphasizing some of the important points, which is number one, in your universities, you have a very defined syllabus that your professor gives you at the beginning of class, right? And it's focused on that specific class. But on the MCAT, the syllabus is going to cover everything. It's going to cover all of the different classes. It's not so restricted as your college courses where your final exam is on one subject. The second thing that we talked about that makes things challenging is that your college exams is focused on one subject, whereas each section of the MCAT, the science sections, test a variety of different subjects. So you have to be able to connect the different concepts together. And the last thing is you can cram for your college exams, but you can't cram for the MCAT just because of all of the different semesters worth of science content that's tested on the exam. All right, so now let's talk a little bit more about how exactly you should study. And this is something that I started talking about yesterday, but when you're thinking about organic chemistry, keep in mind it's not about memorizing a lot of different reactions. It's not like if I have reactant A plus reactant B, I'm going to get product A, versus if I have reactant C and reactant D, I'm going to get product B, right? Again, it's not about that memorization. It's really about making sure that you understand the underlying mechanism, making sure that you understand the concepts. Understanding those concepts is what's going to stick over multiple years if you're taking organic chemistry as a sophomore and taking the MCAT as a senior year. This is also what's going to stick as you go from organic chemistry 1 to organic chemistry 2. If you master the foundations early, it's only going to help you later on because often you simply just have to recall what you previously learned. All right. So the last thing I want to talk about today is a little bit about the study plan. So, there was a question yesterday asking a little bit about how to prepare, how to study for the exam. And I want to talk about this now. So keep in mind that there's really only 2 things you have to be able to do to score well in the MCAT exam, which is you have to review the science content. We usually call it content review. And you need to do practice to learn test-taking strategies. Right? These are the only 2 things that you have to do to study well and get a good score on the exam. So if it's so easy, then where do the issues arise? Well, uh, again, it depends on the student. For some student, they don't spend enough time studying for the exam. So keep in mind what I said yesterday. The average student spends 300 hours studying for the exam, and the average student gets a 500 on the exam. So most students, you should be expecting to study at a minimum 300 hours and probably more than that, right? 400 hours, 500 hours, even up to 1,000 hours. And you might be thinking, well, that seems like a lot. Well, it's not that hard to get there because remember, I said a lot of students will study full time over 3 months, or a lot of students will study part time over 5 to 6 months and up to a year. So if you're studying full time over the summer, you're studying 40 hours a week over 12 weeks, that's 480 hours. So that wasn't so tough to get to 400, 500 hours. If you're studying part-time, let's say 15 to 20 hours per week over 5 to 6 months, that's 20 to 24 weeks. Again, that's going to get you to, doing the math between 300 to, what is that? 24 to 480 hours. So again, the numbers that I gave you, it aligns pretty well with how most pre-meds are studying for the exam. And of course, if you're studying for a year, part-time 15 to 20 hours, then it's very easy for you to get up to 1,000 hours for MCAT prep. So that's the first thing, right? You need to make sure that you're spending adequate time preparing for the exam, and this should be in the order of hundreds of hours. So sometimes students, they don't get a good score because they underestimate the MCAT and they don't put enough time into their MCAT prep. So now let's think about some other issues that students run into. Sometimes it's they're having difficulties maintaining focus, right? They say they're going to go to a library. They say they're going to study for 6 hours. They watch 6 hours of YouTube videos instead on their favorite influencer. We talked about using the Pomodoro technique to make sure if you're going to study, you can study in chunks so it's more manageable. There's also students who they are studying for the exam, and what they have issues with is retaining the information, as in they learn the information and then, a week later, they feel like they forgot all the information. Well, again, that goes back to what I talked about yesterday, which is spaced repetition, making sure that you're reviewing the information over and over again over, certain periods of time that you can gradually increase, but you're planning for a review using spaced repetition. My point really is, for all students who aren't able to score well on the exam, there's a reason for that. And there are strategies that you can use to combat each of those issues and make the adjustments that you need in order to get the score that you want. And the last point I'll make, actually goes to this one right here. This is something that I've just told you that, you need to do content review and you need to do practice to succeed on the exam. So what are some mistakes that students will often make here? Well, mistakes that often make is essentially doing too much of one and not enough of the other. So, sometimes I'll hear from a student and they'll say like, oh, yeah, when I was studying for the exam, I really wanted to focus on content review. So I spent 3 months really just, reading the science content in immense detail. I took super detailed notes. But the problem is that my exam came up and I realized I needed to start doing practice. I only spent about 2 to 3 weeks doing practice. And of course, they did a lot of content review, which is great. They didn't do enough practice. They didn't get the score they wanted. The alternative that I'll hear from other students is, oh, I don't learn very well reading textbooks. I don't learn, very well, learning the science content by itself. I learn better doing practice questions. So I'll hear from students be like, oh yeah, I've done practice questions for 3 months. My score isn't improving. Why isn't my score improving? Well, again, if you don't know the science content, how are you going to answer the questions correct? So, these are common mistakes that students make. They either do too much content review and not enough practice, or too much practice, not enough content review. It's a simple solution. When you're studying for the MCAT, plan on spending half of your time reviewing science content and half of your time doing practice. This schedule works for the vast majority of pre-med students, and it's that simple, right? Which is, if you're going to study 16 weeks for the MCAT, plan on spending 8 weeks doing content review, 8 weeks doing practice. That's perfectly fine. You don't have to overthink it, right? To do one exam, you need to review the science content and you need to do the practice. And for the vast majority of the students, about half of your time doing each. All right, so that essentially covers the points I wanted to go over today. And of course, we still have time for questions. So this time I'll be happy to take any questions you have.
So this is the first question. This person wants to know, what are some of the other upper division science courses that are important to take before the MCAT?
A good question. So the first thing I'll say is, based on what I said earlier, you technically don't need any upper division science courses, right? If you looked at that slide where I gave you a list of all of the prerequisite courses, I didn't include any upper division biology courses. Now, that means, you could just take general biology and study, prepare for the exam, and be fine. But of course, if you can take more advanced biology classes, that certainly won't hurt, and it can certainly help you. So now, which courses can you take? Think about what I said. I said biology on the exam is really split into two halves. The small stuff, molecular, cellular, microbiology, right? Like all of those small stuff. And then the organ systems, physiology. So any of those classes are fine, right? If you want to take anatomy and physiology or just physiology, it's perfectly fine. If you want to take neurobiology, immunology, no, anything in physiology will help. Same thing if you want to take cellular biology, if you want to take genetics, if you want to take microbiology, if you want to take molecular biology, all of that is fine too, right? It's not required, but if you're not in a rush to take the MCAT and you can maintain the two hard science courses per semester, and you want to have additional coursework to help you with MCAT, those are all good courses to take.
Thank you for that. The next question is it advisable to take biochemistry in the summer or senior year? This individual who's asking is considering taking it in the summer, as it would give them more time to prep for the MCAT.
Good question. So the main thing that I emphasized is you really need to take biochemistry before you take the MCAT. I didn't really specify, when, right? So because biochemistry is often at the end of a student's chemistry series, they often take it, later as opposed to earlier. If you take it this summer, there's a nice aspect of that because if your plan is to take the MCAT next spring, then you don't have to worry about biochemistry, in the fall, especially if it's a hard class and you have to spend a lot of time on it. So that's a perfectly fine option. But the other thing I'll say is that, because biochemistry is really important for the exam, studying for a biochemistry class, in a sense, is the same thing as studying for the MCAT. So if you're taking biochemistry that fall and your plan is to take the MCAT in January of 2027, that honestly works pretty well too, because the biochemistry material will be very fresh in your brain. So both options is actually fine, and I think it's kind of just personal preference if you don't want competing obligations between biochemistry and the MCAT.
Thank you for that. Someone else asked, I got a 490 diagnostic in April, and I'll be starting UWorld soon. Do you have any tips on how to improve my score or what I should focus on?
Yeah, so this is kind of a similar question to what we had yesterday, which is there was a student who, was around 495, and what I had told them is, if you're at 495, the fastest way to improve is by filling in your content gaps. So if you're at a 490, you honestly have a lot of content gaps that need to be filled. So my recommendation is actually hold off on starting UWorld because you're kind of at the point where you have so many content gaps that if you start your world, your accuracy is probably going to be like 30% or 40%. In a way, that's kind of, wasting the U word questions, because if you're missing 60 to 70% of the questions, then what exactly are you learning, right? You're kind of at this point where, you just need to spend more time uh, focusing on learning and reviewing the science content. So there's a couple of things that you need to think about, which is if you're behind on your content review, well, let's make sure you start by doing comprehensive content review, right? Get a set of MCAT books. Make sure to read through all the books in detail. Take thorough notes. So that way you've reviewed all of the science content at least once. Or if you've already reviewed all of the science content, maybe it's a retention issue. Download a pre-made Anki deck. Spend a few weeks zeroing out that Anki deck so that way your retention is better. But my first recommendation is at that score, you have too many content gaps and it's not worth starting practice yet. Strengthen and build up your foundational knowledge of the science content. And then once you're feeling better, start your work practice.
Thank you. It's hard to manage the MCAT while taking classes and doing research. How do you recommend managing obligations if you plan to take the MCAT in 3 months?
Yeah, this is a challenge for all pre-meds, right? And a lot of this is, making good decisions. I said earlier, don't take more than 2 hard science classes per semester. The main reason being, if you're taking more than that, then too much of your time is going to be focused on your college courses. You're not going to have time for all of your extracurriculars. Plus, if you're trying to squeeze in MCAT prep, that's going to be nearly impossible. Now, in my experience, this is going to depend on students. There are some students who just, for some reason, always keep themselves busy, always keep themselves occupied. And because their midterm exams are coming up, their final exams are coming up, and their MCAT isn't for months, they often tend to, push off their MCAT and focus on the classes because they're trying to maintain good grades. But the reality is then they're just not studying for the MCAT because they're prioritizing their other commitments first. So for those students, they have to make a decision. They have to decide like, hey, I really want to take the MCAT on this date. Because of that, I'm going to reduce some of my obligations. Perhaps this semester, I'm going to take a lighter course load. Perhaps this semester, I'm going to cut down on my extracurricular activities. Or, I'm going to dedicate this summer to MCAT prep. I'm not going to try to do an internship. I'm not going to try to take summer classes. I'm not going to try to do all of these different things. So ultimately, if you find that you don't have enough time, you have to make some kind of change. And for some students, it might just be too tough for them to juggle classes and extracurriculars at the same time. That's why there's these days more non-traditional students than traditional students. There's a lot of students who they simply have to wait until after they graduate before they have the time to be able to focus on the exam. And there's one thing that kind of helps with this, which is when you're in school, you go to classes, and then when you come home, you still have to study, you still have to do homework, you still have to write essays and such. Once you graduate, if you're working a job, right, if you're working in research, if you're working in a clinical setting, often you're at work doing work and you come home. It's not like you bring your work with you. So that's why, for a lot of those people, because they come home and they don't have all of the additional obligations to study for classes, do homework assignments, that's when they have the time to prepare for the MCAT.
Thank you. Is it okay if general biology is waived by the biology department, or do I need to take it now? I'm currently taking more advanced biology courses, and my advisor suggested waiving general biology since it should not affect me much. I want to make sure that medical schools would not be concerned about this later when I apply.
Unless you get credit by examination, um, you can't just, the school can waive it, but I don't think most medical schools would. And Dr. Tao could answer that better.
Yeah. So we had a similar question. yesterday, right? And this is very common for a lot of students where if you took AP biology or AP chemistry, you're trying to, essentially not take one of those classes. And you have to be careful because, again, if it's waived, do medical schools care, right? What I would say is that, every school is different. So the safe approach is always reach out to medical schools, send an email to their admissions committee. And the admissions committee members are usually pretty nice and they'll respond and, help you with your questions. Uh, Another very good option is look at what other pre-meds at your university did. Because if all the students at your university waive general biology and they get into medical school perfect fine, then it's probably not an issue. But if you see other students at your university and they all took general biology and went on to medical school, they should probably do the same.
Yeah, I think the problem with requirements is twofold. One is every school is different. Some of them will accept it, some of them would waive it. But the other part of it too is at the end of the day, you're going through a human review, and somebody will be like, okay, you know what? This is okay and that's not okay. So it's always, best to cover all your bases. And, certainly those prereqs like OChem, general chem, bio and stuff, those are like non-negotiables and standards. And some of the schools will require you to have biochem or physiology, and those are more, you know, defined by each school, but you want to cover all your bases. You don't want to be that person that's going to apply and you're like, oh, like 20% of the schools want me to have that class and having to take it, before you apply or that summer in your application. It's just you're just going to add yourself more stress. That's my philosophy, but that's.
That makes sense. Um, would you recommend reviewing individual courses and previous coursework for MCAT practice or using MCAT prep, which blends the courses for better application and outcomes?
Use MCAT prep, right? Like I said, get a set of MCAT books. And that just because, again, the curriculum of your college courses does not match the curriculum of the MCAT.
Another question. I've taken all of my prerequisites. Would you suggest retaking courses to increase GPA? Can you elaborate on test taking strategies and how to overcome nervousness and maximizing your score?
So I'd probably need a little bit more context, right? Like, what specifically is your GPA? For example, if you're telling me your GPA is a 3.6 and you want to get it up to a 3.8, that's probably not happening just given how many courses you've already taken. If you're telling me your GPA is, like a 3.2 or a 2.7, then I'd say yes. And what you probably want to consider is, a post-bacc program, to show medical schools that, you're able to retake these classes and get good grades. But I would say, something that helps is in any situation where your GPA is low, recognize you can essentially compensate for that with a high MCAT score, right? So what I mean by that is there's some students who have a high GPA and a low MCAT score. Their acceptance rate is not very good. There are some students with a low GPA and a very high MCAT score. Their acceptance rate is pretty good. So in its way, it's kind of a way to prove yourself, right? Which is sure you may not have done as well in your college courses, but if you crush the MCAT, it really shows, medical schools that you know your stuff. Um,
But I
and
just want to add with that caveat is there's a direct correlation. If you're a 3.0 student, it's it's a 528 MCAT is not going to offset it. It's just going to be too wide of a thing. But also, I would add that if you're a 3.0 student or 2.9 student, really hard to see how you would get a 528. Because ultimately, the MCAT is a test of your mastery of these subjects. And, so, um, yeah.
Yeah. The next question is very similar. 3.0, and a formal post-bacc is not an option due to finances. Do you have any advice?
You can always do a DIY post-bacc, right? Which is, like formal can tend to be expensive. DIY can certainly work. You also have to kind of, think
Dr.
about,
Tao, can you explain what DIY post-bac is? Some people might
sure.
not know it.
So a formal post-bac is, and they're not always called post-bac programs. There's a lot of, special master's programs, or sometimes they'll just do like a master's in physiology or biomedical sciences. There's a lot of these different programs, and they're often quite expensive. And some of them, they'll offer certain perks. They might say like, oh, if you do our program, if you're within a certain percentile of the class. Like if you're in the top 25%, you're guaranteed an interview at something along those lines. Um, a DIY post-bac is essentially, you just go to a university or a community college and you just sign up for classes and take those classes by yourself. Now, the downside, of course, you're not receiving the same guidance. There's not someone telling you all of these things to do. You're not going to have any of those perks of, you know, guaranteed interview if you have a certain performance level. But if you do it by yourself, then the cost is going to be a lot more manageable than one of those post-bac programs. And the other thing I will say is, uh, it's worth doing some research to see what programs are available. And I say this because there's actually some post-bac programs that are actually free and they're designed for certain target populations. Now, often they'll have restrictions. For example, one of the post-bac programs that MedSchoolCoach partners with, right? I've been teaching the MCAT to their post-bac students for 4 years in a row now, is Wayne State University. Wayne State University has a post-bacc program. It's specifically for Michigan residents, right? So you have to be a Michigan resident, but the program is free to the students. They take the same classes as first-year medical students. They get a free comprehensive MCAT prep course, and the program even gives students a stipend. So, you can try to see if there's any programs like that available that I can try to apply for.
Thank you. Um, is it possible that some schools won't accept MCAT scores taken in early January? If so, why do you think? If I can also add on to this question, what general advice would you have on the timeline of taking the MCAT and when you should submit your scores for an application?
Yeah, so if your goal is to take the MCAT this month and start medical school this fall, that's, close to impossible, right? Because you're super late in terms of the MCAT application cycle. Remember, the application season begins in May, right? So the current application cycle began in May, so that's about 7 to 8 months ago. So you're 7 to 8 months behind all the other students, and it's actually more like 8 to 9 months because if you take your MCAT this month, your score doesn't arrive until February. So, as I mentioned yesterday, and you've probably heard this from other presentations, um, your chances of getting to medical school is significantly reduced if you are a late applicant. And a late applicant is not like applying in January, like we're talking about now. A late applicant is someone who applies in July or August instead of May/June. So, if you're talking about taking the MCAT now, you're a super late applicant. And honestly, what you should do is wait until the next application cycle, right? If you want to take the MCAT this month of January, that's great if you want to apply to medical school this summer. So now, in terms of general timeline, my recommendation is generally to uh, take the MCAT by April or May of the year that you're applying. Now, if you want to take the MCAT before that, that's perfectly fine. But the point is, if you want to apply to medical school this summer, plan on taking the MCAT by April or May, if not earlier.
Thank you.
Yeah, and the
What
other
is
thing is of it too is once you submit your application, a lot of schools don't want updates. They don't want to hear from you. They don't, and the reason why is some of them are getting 8, 9,000 applications, and every single update, if everyone has one, that's 8,000 updates, and it's just a staff issue. And even though you want to think that would be automated, there still needs to be uh, that information disseminated. So, yeah.
Mhm. What is your opinion on old prep books? Someone says they have a 2017 set of MCAT prep.
So the MCAT last changed in 2015. So, 2017 is after the change. What I'll say is it's not the books that's going to hold you back, right? It's not like, oh, because I don't have a 2026 set, I'm going to do poorly in an exam. So if 2017 is what you have, it's perfectly fine, right? The material largely has not changed. But that being said, 2017 is on the older end, right? We're getting close to almost a decade. Keep in mind, every year there's so many students who study and prepare for the MCAT, and when they're done with the exams, a lot of them don't do anything with their books. So it's actually pretty easy, if you're on a campus and there's upperclassmen who've already taken the MCAT, a lot of them just like toss their books or just are going to toss their books. So if you ask around, be like, hey, if anyone has, MCAT books that they're not going to use anymore, you can give them to me. It's honestly not that hard to find those kinds of people, especially if you're at a large university.
The other thing that I would suggest too is that some of the big, like for example, if you're at UC Davis, um, if you go to the Sacramento Public Library, you may find MCAT books that you could check out. I'm pretty sure the Davis City Library that those books are gone, like they're checked out. So if you go to a city that's close to a university, a lot of a lot of libraries, city libraries have them as well. Not like school libraries, but like a city library has them.
Thank you. I see one person has their hand raised. If you have a question, feel free to post it in the Q&A. Right now, we have no other questions, but I would like to ask you a question myself. What has motivated you to advise and mentor people throughout the MCAT process?
It's a good question. I mean, I would say I've been teaching and tutoring students for a long time, right? Like I've been tutoring students since I was high school. At first it was kind of just a part-time job, and I just happened to be pretty good at it, so it made sense, and honestly paid more than a lot of manual labor positions. And I just continued through college, in various ways, by being a teaching assistant, as a graduate student instructor at UC Berkeley. And honestly, I just found it very rewarding to be able to teach other students. And one day I came across a Craigslist posting to be an MCAT instructor for the Princeton Review. I applied, and here I am. What, 13 years helping students with MCAT.
Yeah, and I could just say knowing him for a long time, he loves teaching and he's really good at it. So people always say like find what you're passionate about. That's true. But also if you're good at something, you're probably passionate about it, so you do it.
If you don't mind, I'd like to ask a follow-up question. What is your opinion on people who are preparing for the MCAT becoming teachers, teaching assistants, mentors, tutors themselves, in order to further solidify the material?
I think it's perfectly fine, right? And that's actually a very common activity for a lot of pre-meds, to be teaching assistants, to be tutors on their campuses, to lead study groups. So, going back to what I said with the Feynman technique, teaching others is a really good way of improving your own understanding material. So I think it's great.
Thank you. Another question is, what sources do you recommend for practice?
The gold standard is the AAMC, right? The AMC is the best. And what I'll say these days is the AMC has so much practice resources these days, right? Like, a decade ago when the exam changed, there wasn't a lot of practice resources, but they now have 7 full-length AMC practice exams and like another, 2,000 practice questions, right? There's well over 3,000 practice questions. And what I often hear from students is they don't fully utilize all of the AMC practice questions. So, they're the most valuable resources for your MCAT prep. And I would say for many students these days, all you need to do is use the AAMC practice materials. It's a lot of practice and it takes a lot of time to go through all of that practice, right? Probably at least 200 hours of practice and review with just the AMC practice materials. And I see, a question related about this. When should you start your AMC practice materials? So I would say, and again, go back to what I said, which is the average student, studies at least 300 hours. If you're studying, let's say 400 to 500 hours for MCAT, if you're spending about, 200 to 250 hours reviewing science content and 200 hours on the AMC practice materials, that's perfectly reasonable, right? So I know a lot of students will, recommend third-party practice resources, from UWorld and other test prep companies, and those increase the cost. But what I see too often is students saying like, "Oh yeah, I only did like 500 practice questions of the 3,000 question bank." So for a lot of these students these days, the AMC offers more than plenty of practice. If you're studying full time, if you start the AMC practice 8 to 10 weeks before your exam, that's reasonable. If you're studying part time, then it could be, maybe more like 10 to 12 weeks before your exam. That's when you can start the AMC practice resources.
Yeah, the only thing that I would add is Google, search Feynman's lectures in YouTube, and you'll get a good idea. You'll get a really good idea what the Feynman method is. It's actually pretty fun, and if you're taking physics or struggling with it, some of his explanations, and it's not like he doesn't use like it's. I think they're like in the 50s. It's basically chalkboard and chalk, and they're pretty amazing. I like doing it. So like he has this one lecture on light. It's just really phenomenal. Have you ever watched his lectures online?
I have. They're great.
Um, do you mind going over the MCAT application process again and explaining why taking the MCAT in April is late and how it would affect your overall application process?
So April is not late, right? So again, if we're walking through this, right, your goal when you apply to medical school is to be an early applicant. Um, Applications for MD, DO, and Texas schools, they all open around May to June. So your goal is to make sure you have all aspects of your medical school application by May or June. That includes your personal statement, your activities descriptions, your letters of recommendation, your MCAT score, all of that by around May or June. That's how you can be an early applicant. Now, when you become a late applicant is when you don't have all of those pieces ready by May or June. So let's say you take the MCAT in April, you get your MCAT scored in May. That's not a problem at all, right? You can be an early applicant. The issue is more so you take the MCAT in July, you don't get your MCAT scored until August. So you're not ready to apply until 2 to 3 months after the majority of pre-med students have already applied. So there's no issue with April, right? April or May is the latest that I recommend students to take the MCAT to be an early applicant. It's if you take the MCAT after May, if you take it in June, July, August, then you're not able to be an early applicant.
Thank you. Are the practice questions free on the AAMC website?
So yes and no, right? Which is, they are a paid service that the AMC, charges students. But there is a fee waiver program that you can apply for. There are some requirements, but the fee assistance program is actually pretty broad. It's actually not just for MCAT materials, it's also for MCAT registration, also for medical school applications and such.
So I would say somebody asked the question about the MCAT bump. Like we have about 6 GB of content for the MCAT that and I put it on the list. Two of our former presidents took the MCAT on. They studied for the MCAT on the own, and I think one of them got a 524, and the other one got a 522. And they didn't pay for any expensive courses, and they made all of their available content available, and it's like 6 GB. So have at it. So, they have a couple of practice exams. They have, yeah, so just go and look at it and it's there. And the FAP, I put also the link for the FAP, which is a fee assistant program, which basically you reducedly pay for the MCAT, the prep courses, the practice exams, and also you get a huge discount on your application to medical school. And I think it's 15 schools, 16 schools that you apply for like a really reduced rate. It's somebody said it's like $1,200 that you save if you get it. And all you have to do is apply and it's free. 20 schools. Thank you, Loretta. It used to be 15, but now it's 20, so that's awesome. All right, well, it's 11:30, and if I keep Dr. Tao a minute longer, I'm gonna have to answer to his boss, which is his wife, and I don't want to answer to her. So, um, have a good Saturday, my friend. Um, yeah, so somebody asked again, Loretta asked, if you were an only one source of the MCAT, give by five more than enough. Yeah, Loretta's right. There's plenty of information you could get there, but we also have a bunch of practice exams and things that are posted for you. So, alrighty. Well, thank you again. Good seeing you, my friend. Have a good
Twice.